Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Yes, welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm your host, Tyler Alderson, for this episode. And often when we read about history, we read various narratives. We read about large groups of people. Today, we're going to be talking about oral history, individuals telling their own stories, and how those individual stories can tell us so much about the experiences people have lived through. With me today is Bea Lewkowicz, the director of Sephardi Voices UK and AJR Refugee Voices. Bea, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And also Daisy Abboudi, also the deputy director of Sephardi Voices UK. She also does some independent research we'll talk about a little bit later, Tales of Jewish Sudan. Daisy, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having us.
So, first of all, I guess we should start talking about Sephardi Voices UK and this specific project. How is it that you got into this particular project and these particular people?
Okay, so thank you for inviting us and having us on your podcast today. So let me just tell you a little bit about the background of Sephardi Voices UK, which is also linked to my own background, because I wrote my PhD thesis on the Jews of Thessaloniki, which is a very big Sephardi community. And after I finished my research, I started another project called Refugee Voices, where we collected oral histories of Jews from Germany and Austria who had to escape in the 1930s and settled in Britain. And when that project was finished in 2008, I attended a conference in 2009 in Jerusalem, and I was very lucky to meet Dr. Henry Green, who had an idea to gather the voices of the Mizrahi Jews who had to leave their homes. Many became refugees post-48, post the creation of the State of Israel. So I was very lucky that I could use the expertise I had gathered in Refugee Voices to set up this project called Sephardi Voices, where the idea was that we would gather and capture the stories of the Jews from North Africa, the Middle East, and Iran, who came to the UK. And I should say, in the UK, we have about 264,000 Jews. These are people who answered Jewish on the 2011 census. And out of that group, we think that about 15,000 consider themselves Sephardi or Mizrahi, which would mean that 6% of the total Jewish population in the UK. That seems like a small number, but it's a very important group because it is the largest group of post-war Jewish migration into Britain. So while Refugee Voices deals with mainly migration in the 30s and some in the 40s, here, when we're talking about Sephardi Mizrahi Jews, they mostly came in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And their stories have not been documented. So when we started it, there was no oral history archive dealing with this. In recent years, there have been efforts to collect the stories. And the reasons for this, maybe we can discuss it a bit later, are manifold, why the stories haven't been gathered. So our aim was to gather the stories. We decided to video them, to film them, and make them available to the public. Yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
And before we, I guess, get much further, we should talk about what exactly you mentioned, that it's Jews from North Africa, the Middle East, and that general area. But there's also a nomenclature thing. So is Sephardi and Mizrahi you work with? You were explaining to me before, and I was trying to figure out the distinction. Mizrahi and mostly you work with Mizrahi Jews, but you called it Sephardi Voices.
Yes. So Sephardi is the Hebrew word for Spain. Sepharad means Spain in Hebrew. And it's traditionally used to refer to Jews from Spain or Portugal. And the Jews of Spain or Portugal were expelled in the late 15th century and settled in often in the Ottoman Empire. And there they joined other communities in cities like Aleppo, Damascus, Baghdad, or Cairo, and also, of course, in North Africa and the Middle East. And there they joined the more indigenous Jewish communities in the Middle East, who we call Mizrahi. Mizrach stands for East in Hebrew. These Jewish communities, they're descended from the ancient communities of the Middle East, and after the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem, they were exiled to Babylon, and some remained and spread across the region, forming major Jewish communities. And some also developed their own dialects, like a Judeo-Arabic spoken by Iraqi Jews. So often, we use Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews because their history, the Mizrahi and Sephardi history, was really intertwined since the 15th century. But also there's another reason that in terms of Jewish rituals, the Mizrahi Jews are more similar to the Sephardi Jews, so hence Sephardi Jews. So Sephardi Jews is a sort of broader term, and we use it in an more inclusive way.
And that was actually...
Daisy wants to add something to this, I don't know.
Just that some of our interviewees are descended from the Jews who left Spain during the Spanish Inquisition, and some of them, their families have been in the countries that they were born in for thousands and thousands of years. So that's kind of why we settled on Sephardi Voices as a broader term.
Yes, and maybe to add to this, so it's quite interesting. So, for example, in a country like Morocco, we had distinct communities. So you have some Sephardi communities. For example, one of our interviews is called Bettina Caro, and she can trace herself back to a famous Rabbi Caro in Spain. And they spoke Ladino, a sort of 15th century Spanish dialect. But they were in Morocco. There were also other communities, the sort of more indigenous communities.
And in Egypt as well. The same thing happens in Egypt.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you about something that you mentioned that might seem, I guess, slightly counterintuitive for some people when you were discussing the Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews, that after the creation of the State of Israel, after the war, was actually when a lot of them became refugees. For a lot of people, they might think, well, the creation of the State of Israel, they might move there. What were the issues that forced so many of them to become refugees from areas, as you say, that they might have been in for thousands of years, maybe not entirely without incident, but they had been there, their families had been there for a long time, and now suddenly uprooted.
It's a very complex historical issue and different for each country. So that's important to keep in mind. I think the broader issues are the rise of nationalism in the various countries, which also has to do with post-colonialism. And the second is the position of Jews in the countries where they were sort of suddenly being suspected of Zionist collaborators or being Zionists. So it made it very difficult for example, in Iraq, to be Jewish. So they became refugees because, for example, let's talk about Iraq. The Jews didn't want to leave, but they were sort of forced to leave, and there was a huge mass immigration in the early 50s. Where Jews left under difficult circumstances, so it wasn't a voluntary migration. Yeah, but I think the general thing is the rise of nationalism contributed to making things very difficult for Jews and other minorities in the region.
I would add that I think we use 1948 as a kind of guide date, but actually the problems in for example, in Iraq, there was a pogrom called the Farhud, which resulted in the deaths of, we know around 200 Jews, but actually probably was a lot more, and we'll probably talk about that later. But that was in 1941 and was linked to anti-Semitism around the world, fueled by Nazi ideology. So these were things that were there before the creation of the State of Israel. And in other countries, even the creation of the State of Israel didn't really make much of an impact until the rise of Pan-Arabism and the wars that started with Israel. So it's not so much the creation of the State of Israel that led to these problems, rather that the way that the creation of the State of Israel changed the politics of the region. And I think even now in the UK and in the States, when things happen in the Middle East, it impacts on Jews in the diaspora. And it was the same in the Middle East, but to a much more intense level.
Yes, and you can also maybe add to that the creation of Israel was also partly the result, different things, but also the result of a sort of nationalism
and the end of the British Empire. It all links, and a lot of these countries were part of the British Empire or part of the French, they were French colonies or British colonies. And when they gained independence, that again changed the politics and the dynamics of the region. So it's all interlinked into a much wider image. And in the end, it impacted greatly on individuals' lives.
Yeah, maybe just to add, I think that's a very good thing to think about. End of empire towards nation states. So whether it was the British Empire or Ottoman Empire, where people lived in multilingual situation, multi-religious, multi-ethnic. This was the accepted reality, and this was changing, and things then became more difficult for Jews and other minorities.
And that's another thing that I think is really important. Certainly, great to have the organization around this time, because obviously oral history is something that is much easier to do when the subjects are alive than when they are dead. Some would say it's much more possible to do when they are alive. And right now, we have a lot of anyone who would have had living memory of, say, 1941 would be very old. What is the scope of the project that you've been doing? How far back at this point can you go, and have you gone in terms of learning about some of these, especially more early on issues?
Yeah, I could just say, so one of our oldest interviewees is Abdallah Dangour, and he was born in 1914 in Baghdad. So,
wow.
I think we're very fortunate to have interviewed somebody who was born in 1914. And I can say for my refugee, with my other hat, directing the AJR Refugee Voices project, which deals with survivors and refugees from the Holocaust. There, we were even luckier. We interviewed somebody who was born in 1906. But that's because we started the project a bit earlier. So here, our oldest interview is born in 1914. Many other interviews, when we interviewed them, were in their 70s or in their 80s. And, we can go back as far as they remember. But I would say for the Iraqi Jews, the Fahud in 1941, which Daisy mentioned before, is a very, very crucial event, and often marks the sort of beginning of something, beginning of an end, or beginning of problems for Jews. So that's an important part in those histories. But yeah.
In terms of just our demographics of who we've interviewed, our majority of our interviews were born in the 1940s, and second after that is the 1930s. So as you say, and sadly, a few of our interviews have since passed away after we've interviewed them. So time is of the essence, and we generally try and interview older people first, or we have interviewed some younger people who were born in the 60s, 70s. But generally, we try and speak to older people because, as you say, time is of the essence. And these are stories that weren't written down. These are experiences that haven't been written. And it is a race against time.
Well, we've talked a little bit about the limitations of oral history at this point. So why don't we get into the reasons why you did choose oral history? As I said at the start, we normally, when people are thinking of history, they're thinking about these big sweeping narratives. They're thinking about the wars in which you might be talking about, movements of thousands of people at once. Why is it that you found it so important to focus on individual stories and individual voices?
So, as I mentioned before, I started collecting oral histories when I was doing my research on the Jews of Thessaloniki, and spent many years then, transcribing it, editing it, and putting it together as a book. And I realized in that time that there's nothing more powerful than the personal experience, but more than that, the voice, the intonation. We have video, so you can see an image as well, and that very grand, complex historical processes are sort of distilled in individual experience. And I think as a learning tool and understanding human nature, but complex historical processes, there's nothing better than oral history. And in my experience, we see that in our social media, how powerful stories are, and how interested people are in listening to stories they don't know much about. So when we started it, I think for me it was very important also that we would film people, because then you have an additional layer on top of just the oral history. You can actually see people, and I think especially because these stories are not known, the individual experience is so rich, and you can learn so much from it.
Yeah, and I think I'd add that when as Bo says, that they're not well-known events anyway, but I think anyone can relate to having a story told to them firsthand, and especially when it's something that's happened to the person speaking, it brings history to the present in a way that a written summary of an event can't. And it adds an extra layer. It reminds you that all of history is the story of people, and it's the ordinary people that these big events impact. And I think that's, again, quite relevant for today.
Yes, and maybe also the wonderful thing is to see that people who've experienced similar things narrated it quite differently, and don't necessarily experience it the same. So there's also a huge variety of experiences in a project like ours, depending on many different factors. But for example, just to say to relate to what Daisy said, for example, when people remember themselves as children, and often we have these oral histories are about journeys, leaving a place, displacement, settling, finding new homes. The stories of children are very pertinent, and of course relate also to today's child refugees. But for example, I remember an interviewee who that's quite common as well. Often children were sent to boarding schools in England because the parents felt situation is a bit unstable here for Jews. Let's send the children out and then maybe follow the children later. And for some children, that was very traumatic, to be sent as young children from very close-knit communities suddenly, to England to go to school here. And I think that's something, we can all relate to.
It is amazing, and you sent over some clips, which we're going to hear some of those a little bit later, some of the clips, and it does bring you very viscerally when they're talking about certain things happening to that time again, as I'm sure it brought them. And one of the things that I wanted to ask was just about the methods and how you went about talking to people. Obviously, some of these are very traumatic memories. Some of these are, I'm sure, very tough times for them to think about. How is it that you approached people and talked to them about these issues and made them, feel comfortable actually telling you these really incredible narratives?
So I think the first thing to say is that we never ever force someone to be interviewed, even if their child, it's a lot of the time it's from their children or their grandchildren. They will get in contact with us and they will say, please interview my grandmother. She's got an amazing story. And if that lady doesn't want to talk, then we will not force them to talk. We will never put pressure on someone to interview with us. And I think that's very important. Beyer will probably tell you that there is actually a reluctance amongst the Sephardi Mizrahi Jewish communities to talk in a way that there probably isn't with Holocaust survivors. And that's some of it, I think, is a cultural thing. And I think some of it is the nature of the stories they're telling. They seem, whether that is the truth or not, it seems to them that it is a more politically dangerous thing to talk about than it probably feels to a Holocaust survivor, for example. Beyer, would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, so just the first thing to say, as Daisy said, we never pressure anyone to be interviewed. And it's very, very important for us to understand that the person really wants to talk. And also when we do the interview, we say it's a life history interview. We ask open questions. We don't have an agenda with an academic project, but we always make it clear it's the story of the interviewee. If they don't want to talk about something, we don't have to talk about it. It is their story. So I think that's the first thing. Also, we didn't have it that often, but if somebody changes their mind and they release the interview and then they change their mind, that's absolutely fine. We withdraw the interview. So, that's, I think, a very, very important thing. The second thing is, yes, we have there are people who feel they can't talk. And of course, we have to remind ourselves, that, for example, take the Jews of Iran. There is still a large Jewish community in Iran. And people are sometimes afraid, what they would say, would that impact a relative in Iran? So because there is a sort of still ongoing political situation, some people are much more reluctant. But another important topic is, while we talk about ruptures and displacement and trauma, often the interviewees see themselves much more, they present their agency and their resilience and their choice of emigration. So maybe some of them don't feel the need quite to give testimony. And that's quite different, from the Holocaust testimony at this point, where people on the whole, want to give testimony at this point in history. So for the Sephardi Mizrahi Jews, some of them don't necessarily feel that it's important to give testimony. Some do, but some don't.
No, there's definitely an attitude of that was in the past. I've built my life here now, and we should look at the present and focus on that because that's in the past and it's gone. And I think whether that's a coping mechanism or whether that's an attitude, because actually a lot of these people that we interview, their families have traveled and have moved. I mean, my family, my grandparents came from Sudan, were born in Sudan. And I actually worked out when I was joining Sephardi Voices, I can't remember what I was working it out for, but I worked out that for 5 generations in my family, no one has lived or died I lived and died in the same country, which is actually quite incredible when you think about it. And I think there is this attitude of moving on, looking forward, don't look back, which does make it hard at times to get people to speak. But having said that, we've done over 100 interviews, and they are amazing, the things that people tell us.
And maybe just to add to that, yes, as Daisy said, the Jews were part of empire, so there was lots of movement from different countries, or people got themselves a bride from another country and moved from another country. But I think talking about migration, we're talking about more recent migration, let's say coming to England. And as we know in oral history, sometimes it takes a generation for the next generation being able to talk. That sometimes takes some time. So, we in terms of this oral history project, some people came, in the 50s, 60s, so that's not that long ago. So anyway, so maybe our hope is that the more people talk, the more other people will join. And I think we've experienced that with Sephardi Voices, that some people who were reluctant at the beginning, they've seen other people have come forward, and they feel more encouraged to add their own voice as well to the story.
You asked us. Oh, sorry.
Oh, no. Go ahead.
Just you asked us how we get them to open up and tell us things. And I think one of the most important aspects of that is the lack of judgment. They can say whatever they want to us, and we will never say to them, "Oh, are you sure that might not be true?" Because the way they experience history is what we're interested in.
Yeah, so absolutely. So an oral history archive is about memory and lived experience. It is not. It is about history, but it is about the experience of history. So it is not our job, to correct people. We are there to capture their stories and their views, and I hope we make that clear. Having said that, if somebody has an experience of traumatic history, for some people that is difficult, and in those situations, I think we are there to chronicle their story, to be respectful, and just to listen. And I think that's important. A wonderful aspect of oral history is the listening aspect, and that's what we're doing. We are there to listen.
It's amazing how people open up when they realize they're being truly listened to.
Listening is so crucial for oral history. And I think what is often forgotten, that it's actually really difficult to listen. And in our interview training, we try to emphasize how important it is not to interrupt the interviewees, and to leave pauses and not necessarily go to the next question. And I think it is not a natural skill, because when you have a conversation with somebody, you interrupt constantly, and you have to train yourself not to do that. And I have to say, for me, that was a really a steep learning curve, because obviously when you then edit afterwards and you hear your own voice and you don't want to hear your own voice, that's not great. But also in terms of giving somebody the space to talk, I think it's very, very important. And the more interviews you do, the more experience you have. So, for example, you ask about trauma. What do we do? If somebody starts crying, your natural instinct would be maybe to go and interrupt the interview and hug them and do something. But in terms of oral history, it's actually much better to accept that as part of their testimony and just accept it. And unless the person says, let's stop filming, then of course we stop, to just be there and continue. So for me, one of the things I've learned doing so many oral histories is really, I think I have improved my listening skills. So that's just something which I think is a wonderful thing about oral history.
It's wonderful, and it's wonderful to hear, and that's one thing as well. When we talk about people being truly listened to, this is something, and I would highly encourage. We're going to drop a link on the Reddit post, the announcement when this podcast actually gets out there. So everybody, when you're listening to this, you can click on the link. You can also just go to sephardivoices.org.uk. And you can find the website. And can you just explain how it is that you are putting these interviews out there, such that that people can actually access them? They can see there's some wonderful pictures on the website that you see right there, and that people can actually experience some of this themselves and learn more.
So we are launching a new website, or we have launched a new website, and you will be able to see all the people who have given their testimonies. you can access their photographs, because we should also say we're not only a video archive. For each person, we also capture photographs and documents. So we are also really a photograph archive, and these are available. We have also made short films of individuals. Those are also available. At the moment, you will not be able to see the whole interview of one person. If you want to listen to them or watch it, in Britain, you go to the British Library. It's also deposited in Israel at the Diaspora Museum, Bet HaTfutzot. And the reason for it is that we feel we need to protect the interviews, and that the narratives need to be contextualized. So what we don't want things taken out from interviews and misconstrued. And that's a challenge in oral history as well, is this sort of decontextualized, quoting from this or that. So we feel at the moment, it's a good way of sharing is edited excerpts from interviews and films we make. But if somebody wants to watch the whole interview, of course, they can get in touch with us. But in England, for example, they can go to the reading room of the British Library.
Yeah. And researchers can always get in touch with us, and we'll send them the relevant paperwork. They are an academic resource, and they are there for academics to use as a resource.
And also, maybe to add, another very important aspect for us is that the interview is made available to the families. So, after we've done the interview, a few weeks later, the interview is put on a memory stick and is sent to the interviewee. And I think that's a very satisfying part of our work. And we get mostly very positive feedback of the interviewee, who could then watch the interview with their children. And sadly, in some instances, the children are very, very happy to have the testimony of their parent because they passed away.
And just a little bit more about the kind of content we have on the website. We've spent a lot of time talking about the trauma and the displacement and the hardships that our interviewees have gone through. But there's also the aspect of their daily lives, spending time with their families, going to school, the way they celebrated the Jewish festivals, all sorts of really lovely memories that they have, and that's also online. So that they're also included in what we talk about. We don't focus solely on the displacement aspect of their lives. This is their life story in its entirety, not just the bits that we think are relevant for history.
This also applies to, their lives post-immigration.
Yeah.
We've interviewed some prominent people, some people who became artists, who became writers, who became businessmen. So that's also an important part of their story. What did they do after they arrived in England?
And I was just going to say, I think that's wonderful, because I know from personal experience, I remember my grandfather was Filipino. He was, in World War II. And, you know that it was obviously a very tough time, having been invaded. But also he'd talk about, listening to Glenn Miller and, and jazz on the radio. And so some of the things that the times that you might think are the hardest times, there are actually interesting and happy memories from those times, which I think is always interesting to get into. I'm sure there have been a lot of those surprises while you're doing the oral history projects.
Absolutely. So, for example, we interviewed a man called Yeheskel Kodjaman, who became a sort of specialist in Iraqi music, on the Makam music. And he talks a lot about the music he listened to when he was young. And it's really interesting. And we were lucky enough we could share this clip in a musicology conference. And people really appreciate it. So I think there are lots of nuggets in there, very rich nuggets. And also, whether it's to do with schooling, with the social clubs people went to. We said before, each country is quite different because we cover many countries: Egypt, Morocco, Iraq, Iran. But when you listen to the stories, there are some similarities. So, for example, schooling, there was a school called Alliance Israélite Universelle, which was a French school which wanted to give Jewish education, and they were present in the whole of the Ottoman Empire. So many children were sent to these Alliance schools, and it's really interesting to compare the stories, and they were taught in French, and hence many people actually speak French. So that's the schooling part. I think is always an interesting aspect of the stories, and the multicultural aspect of that story, of that schooling as well, with many Egyptian interviewees who talk about their multicultural upbringing in Alexandria or in Cairo, and it's absolutely fascinating.
Shall we listen to Roger Bilbul at this point? It might be a good point while we're talking about the multiculturalism and the daily experiences of daily life.
Absolutely. So they have sent over, Daisy and Bea have sent over some clips, and we will listen right now. This is actually, why don't you set it up? So this is Roger Bilbul from Egypt.
This is Roger Bilbul. He was born in 1940 in Alexandria in Egypt, and he's talking in this clip about going to the cinema.
We used to go to the cinema a lot, and all the films that were shown in Egypt were always shown in their original language. However, there were subtitles. So if it was an English film, there would be French and Arabic subtitles. If it's a French film, there would be English and Arabic subtitles. If it's an Arabic film, there would be French and English subtitles. And me and my cousin, we would go and watch whatever was showing and come out of it and try and emulate the main characters in the film and being imbued by all this influence. However, until today, I feel more comfortable with subtitles than without subtitles. And it's not so much because I'm hard of hearing, but I was so used to seeing subtitles that I even remember once dreaming with subtitles.
I think we should probably explain that French was a language that was very, it was commonly spoken amongst the Jews of Egypt, as well as English and Arabic. So I think, first of all, it just shows the fact that it wasn't, I think now when we talk about multiculturalism, we have this idea, and actually Roger goes on to talk about it in his interview, that when we talk about multiculturalism now, we kind of talk about this kind of monolithic way of everyone kind of conforming in some way to fit together. Whereas the way he puts it in Egypt, it was the opposite. Everyone was proud of their differences, and yet everyone was happy to celebrate each other's differences. You know, in Sudan, for example, because I'm more comfortable maybe talking about Sudan with the Jews and the Muslims would help each other cook for each other's festivals. And it's not all roses. There were problems, but on the whole, especially if you are of a certain class, there was this symbiosis. People were living alongside each other in a way that I don't really think happens now anywhere.
Yes, just to add to that, because, you know, one of my interviews with a Sudanese lady called Regina Ashkenazi stands out because, again, she was describing on Jewish holidays that they invited everyone, and they went to the Muslim holidays, they went to their neighbors in a place called Wat Medani, and that what close relationship they had. And that's difficult to imagine today. Also, for example, another interviewee who lived in the Lebanon, she was actually born in then Palestine, in Tiberias, and was sent to school in Lebanon, and every week came home to Tiberias. And, you know, in today's perspective, it's difficult to imagine how somebody who, you know, lives in Israel would just travel to Lebanon and then come back. So those are the wonderful stories. But just to say also, what we heard in this clip by Roger Bilbul also shows the amazing power of oral history, because what it does, it makes us think about something, you know, because we see films with subtitles, but I mean, that somebody's used to subtitles, and that has such a lasting impact on somebody. It's a wonderful little thing to think about.
And the fact that there were cinemas showing all these different films. I think people think of the Middle East, people forget that it's, a place where there are cinemas, and there are, especially then, it was a wonderful, modern city, Alexandria. And I think that's also slightly forgotten in the whole narrative of things and of the history of the Middle East.
It's a fascinating clip, and that's just one of the many that you've sent over. It's always fun to hear these voices. Is there another clip that you would like to talk about? I know you had mentioned some of your work, Daisy, with Jews from Sudan, and I don't know whether you'd like to go into that one or another one.
The Jews of Sudan, again, how, as we said, every country has a different story, and within every country, each decade almost has a different story. The Jews of Sudan were actually quite, maybe lucky is not the right word, but there was no decree of expulsion in Sudan like there was in many other countries. There were no public executions like there were in other countries. In general, the Jews of Sudan left because they felt uncomfortable. There was growing anti-Semitism, but one thing about Sudan is that actually it wasn't to that extent that it was in many other countries, and yet the way that people speak about anti-Semitism, even in Sudan, to me seems very jarring. So they will say things like you're going to hear in the clip. Well, let's. I'll let you play the clip. This is Jack Taman. He was born in 1944 in Khartoum, in Sudan.
I remember a lot of things. I remember one thing is when we had to, for example, to bring matzah in the Sudan. We cannot put the Star of David. We have to get the matzah from whatever country it is, but the box itself has to be plain, nothing in it. The only place we are allowed to put the Star of David was outside our synagogue, even if we are that. That's the only place.
And you're right, that does sound very jarring. It's interesting. I mean, when you were saying there were no public executions and there were no expulsions, that's a pretty low bar in my mind, at least. Maybe not in the experience of so many people. But even that sounds, I mean, that's an erasure of culture. If you can't, use your religious symbols as you like, that must have felt, pretty oppressive.
Absolutely. And I think that's the thing, that the way that they measure anti-Semitism is sometimes mind-boggling to us, and actually quite a stark warning, because, again, for example, Jack Taman, when he's talking, he says, people will say things like, oh, you dirty Jew, but it was nothing, it didn't affect my life. And you think, well, actually, that's actually quite shocking. But I think that's, again, it is for me, I think I do take it as a warning in terms of the way that you can normalize things in your own mind. And yeah, I think it's quite powerful. Yeah.
I think it also shows that, most of our interviewers really felt, despite anti-Semitism, which was there, they felt very, very much at home where they lived, and they were part of the societies. So, in any oral history interview, we have to remember that, it is the sort of overall identity which sort of shapes your narrative.
Yeah.
So, if you feel very Iraqi or Egyptian, or, you will portray these things in a certain way, because overall you were happy where you were.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing with oral history. Well, if you feel you're maybe less of something, then maybe you'll focus more on those difficult aspects.
And we have a film on our website about identity, And it's actually amazing. I think at the end of every interview, we ask people how they see themselves, what they see as their identity. And I don't think we've got two similar answers in over 100 interviews, because it's such a personal question. And it definitely, the way that you see yourself affects the way you tell your story. Absolutely.
Is that the question that you asked? I was just thinking of one of the clips that you sent over, Abdullah Dangoor, who talks about his Iraqi identity.
Yes, so that's definitely Abdullah Dangoor was one of our early interviews. And it was very humbling to listen to him, and how, no question how proud he feels to be Iraqi. And also, for all the Iraqis, they see themselves as Babylonian Jews. They have been there for more than 3,000 years. They feel that the indigenous people of Iraq, and that comes across this very, very strongly, in his interview.
How can I deny that I'm an Iraqi? I didn't go there as an immigrant. I've been there for 3,000 years.
When he says that, he says he has been there for 3,000 years. It feels almost that he personally has been there for 3,000 years, but that's the strong affinity to Iraq. And, I think this shows two different things. So, for example, he was actually sent to study at the London School of Economics in London, and then went back to Baghdad in 1936-37 to work in the family's business. So, people came here to study and then went back. But what it shows, you see, I think the case of Iraq is different, let's say, from Egypt, because the Iraqi Jews really identified with Iraq, and they spoke Arabic. So, while many Jews, especially in North Africa and Egypt, they spoke French, as we mentioned earlier, the Iraqi Jews, they also spoke some French and English, but their main language was Arabic.
And in Sudan as well, they spoke Arabic. And I do think language plays a big part in the way. And don't forget, we're conducting these interviews in our interviewee's second language in a lot of cases.
But I mean, for example, so when we talk about identity, you see, while in Egypt, for example, many Jews, there were Greeks, there were Jews. It was a sort of Ottoman situation, similar to, when I studied the Jews of Salonika. The nation state was young. So in Iraq became a nation state earlier. So hence the Jews identified with Iraq more.
Yeah.
And I think that comes across in Mr. Dangoor's interview, but in many other interviews. And we're again in a fortunate position. The Dangoors are, a very important, respected family. And we interviewed Abdullah Dangoor's two sisters there in our collection as well. So we have three members of the same family.
And as you mentioned before, I just want to emphasize this. He was born, you said, in 1914. That interview, on the date on the recording, it says 2010. So he was 96 years old at that point. Just incredible to be able to have somebody who has lived through so much.
And he was born in Baghdad when it was still part of the Ottoman Empire, before it became part of the British Mandate. So, and his grandfather was Hacham Ezra Dangoor, who was the chief rabbi of Baghdad. So it is pretty amazing that we interviewed somebody who was still, born in 1914 Ottoman Empire.
Are there any particular clips that you would like to go to? We have another one from Iraq.
I think maybe let's listen to Ivy Shashua.
I think, should we give some context before?
Yes.
So,
do you want to speak? Yeah. Why don't you speak about Iraq and then I'll speak about Ivy?
So Iraq gained independence in 1932, and from 1932 1933 onward, there was increasing anti-Semitic laws and increasing discrimination against the Jews living in Iraq. For example, there were quotas in where they could work, and they weren't allowed to work in the civil service. There were a few different things, and this was partly fueled by a growing Nazi ideology. In 1941, so during the Second World War, the British invaded Iraq, and the government of Iraq at the time was pro-Axis, and the British army defeated the government or pushed back the government. The government fled Baghdad, the capital, and the British forces set up camp just outside Baghdad. There's a bridge called the Al-Khor Bridge leading into Baghdad, and they set up camp outside the city for 48 hours, which meant that Baghdad was effectively without a government for those 48 hours. And during that time, a pogrom broke out against the Jewish community. Like I said before, 180 named casualties, but it's likely that there were up to 600 or maybe more, because people were pushed into the Tigris, into the river, and there are lots of more casualties that we don't know about. There were reported 1,000 injuries, so again, probably more. Estimated 500 to 1,000 homes and business vandalized and destroyed. And whether you survived was, if you lived in the wrong area where these pogroms was at its height, this pogrom is called the Farhud. And if you lived in one of those areas, your life really depended on whether someone was going to save you. So Bayer interviewed, did you interview Ivy?
Yes, I did.
So Bayer interviewed Ivy Shashua, who was a child during this time.
Yes, I think to add, the Farhud was, for many interviews, as I said before, a watershed moment. And what's also interesting about the Farhud, it's now recognized that this is a part of the history of the Holocaust, which is often forgotten, because the Farhud happened because of all this anti-Jewish propaganda. There was a very active German ambassador called Groha, and the anti-Semitic propaganda was very virulent. So this, in a way, led to the events of the Farhud. And some, a lot of interviewees who experienced the Farhud, then they talk about it in detail. But one interview stands out. Her name is Ivy Shashua. She was born 1933 in Baghdad. Her father worked in the construction business, and they lived in the Karada district of Baghdad. And she talks about 15 minutes in her testimony only about the Farhud. And we're going to play the clip. But after the Farhud, they escaped to Iran. They were so scared they escaped the country, and they came back a few months later. And she had also quite a traumatic story in her 50s when she had to leave Iraq. But maybe we can listen to the clip first, and then I'll tell you what happened to her afterwards.
Apparently, there was one army fellow used to buy every bullet for 1 dinar. Dinar was a pound then, to kill Jews, if there are any Jews. And he used to say, there were nearly 17 Jewish people in this house. Where are they? Was looking for us. And she said to him, they went in the morning, early morning, they went to the other friend. Her aim was, if we had anything buried or anything hidden, to find out before we would be killed. Because at the end of the evening, at lunchtime, she came, pulled a drawer, and got a saber, a big, long knife, put it in her belt. And my father asked her, Jamila, you will want to sleep in the evening. Where will you put us? He said, we will be digging a big hole. We put you in it and we'll cover you till the morning. A friend of my father who was in the army, his name was Qasim. He was looking for my father. He knew about the pogrom. What he found, the house was empty, literally empty. Even the windows were taken out. The doors were taken out. The banisters were taken out. And there were only papers in the house. And our cat, we used to have a cat, she was meowing all the time. And there was no sign of life at all. So he asked the people, where are these people who lived in this house? He pulled his gun and he said, I will shoot you if you don't tell me. He said to him, I know where they are and I will take you to them. So he came in these little narrow alleyways calling Saleh. But this woman, Jamila, told us not to speak and not to make a noise or that nobody would know that we were there. We didn't answer. Saleh, Saleh, Saleh. At the end he came and he said, Saleh, I am Qasim. So we came out. He took us to this car. We couldn't fit. So many of us. Who do you leave behind? Those are left behind will be killed. In those days, the car used to have a platform. And then you open the door. So they stood on the platform, put their hand around the windows, and we all fitted in.
This story really stands out because Ivy describes how, as a young girl, she had to hide in a hut to escape the mobs. Most interviewees, they say they were saved by a neighbor. They went into, they could go to somebody else. They were sort of lucky. The neighbor saved them, or they went to another family member in another part of town. But Ivy is one of the few people who really describes the fear she experienced. And I have to say that, that permeates the whole interview, and how lucky she was to be saved by one friend of the father who came, who literally came with his car to save them. And it's really interesting because you can this fear which she describes in the Fahud, it really is there in the whole narrative, and when she talks about she introduces her themes of migration, loss of freedom, persecution, migration. So when she talks about other things, she also always comes back to that element of fear, and maybe that's also partly the result because they wanted to leave. She wanted to leave in the 50s. Wanted to leave Iraq, but it was not so easy. Her father didn't want to go immediately, and she was too young. The Jews in Iraq, if they wanted to leave, they had to renounce their citizenship in 1951. And the government basically gave them a window, I think it was about 1 year, where the Jews could renounce their citizenship. And this led to a mass emigration of 120,000 Jews who were brought to Israel, which is a really interesting part of history. So she couldn't renounce her citizenship because she was too young. And that's why she couldn't leave. So what they did, they first pretended to be somebody else's children, and she received papers which made her older, but that didn't work because by that time then the window was closed, and the immigration, this particular scheme was closed. So in 1956, her parents, brother, and herself managed to get passports, because we should say not many people had passports at the time. And of course, without the passport, you couldn't travel. They received the passport and went on a so-called holiday to Cyprus, leaving all their things behind. And that's a very important a part of a lot of the Iraqi interviews. They had to leave everything behind. They closed the door, couldn't take anything with them. And they went to Cyprus. And in Cyprus, Ivy and her brother were deported to Israel because their permit had expired. And eventually also her parents were deported, and they went to Israel. And then some years later, she came to the UK. But, it shows that not only the Fahud was traumatic, but also her experiences in the 50s and the way she left Iraq was also very traumatic.
And I think this thing of leaving everything behind is very common across a lot of countries, actually, that people left either pretending they were going on holiday. In my Sudan, we didn't interview her for Sephardi Voices because she doesn't live in the UK. But one of the interviewees told me, I left even with sausages in the fridge. And I think that's something, sausages half made in the fridge. And I think that's something that actually is very common in Egypt, in Sudan, in Iraq, in Libya. Again, lots of countries where people literally left overnight with a suitcase, and that was it. They never went back. They never saw their friends again. In some cases, it was decades until they saw the rest of their families again. And I think that's actually quite a common thread. As much as we've said the experiences in every country and for every person was different, that happened a lot.
And in some cases, family members couldn't see each other because the window of opportunity closed. So, for example, in Iraq, when you left the country and stayed more than 3 months outside, this was in the 50s, your citizenship was renounced. There was something put in the newspaper saying so-and-so citizenship is renounced. So they couldn't come back, and the people who were in Iraq couldn't go out. So we interviewed a lady who hadn't seen her son for 10 years when she was reunited here in the UK. So, and so there was a very difficult situation for many family members. And to give some numbers, so you have to keep in mind that it is about 850,000 Jews who left the Middle East, North Africa, post-1948. So that's a lot of people.
And we actually have, I believe, another clip, this one also about leaving. This one from Emmanuel Menachem.
Yeah. So this is Emmanuel Menachem. He was born in Egypt in 1948 in Port Said, and he left in 1956. So he was still, he was 12 years old. Yeah, 12 years old. So during the Suez crisis, do we need to explain the Suez crisis, or will listeners know?
A brief overview is probably good.
So in 1956, American, British, and Israeli forces made a move to gain control of the Suez Canal, which was from Egyptian control. And as a result of that, French, British, and other foreign citizens in Egypt were expelled. A little bit of background before that: it had virtually been impossible for Jews in Egypt to have Egyptian citizenship. During the early days of British colonization in the 1800s, there was a brief window where people could buy Egyptian citizenship, but it was very difficult. So only a very small number of Jews in Egypt actually had Egyptian citizenship, even if they'd been there for hundreds of years. Instead, they were either stateless or they bought European passports. So, someone was born in Italy 3 generations back, so they bought Italian passport, which meant that a lot of Jews had French or British citizenship. So when the Suez crisis broke out, a lot of them were expelled. And Emmanuel lived in Port Said, which is where a lot of the bombing was happening. And he left with his family again overnight very quickly. And you'll hear his experiences of that now.
Absolutely. So this is Emmanuel Menachem.
We saw a lot. We used to get up in the morning and sometimes go to school. We used to see dead bodies in the streets, literally lying on the floor by the curb, because there was fighting during the night. There was a curfew, obviously no lights. We came to a point when it was too dangerous to live where we were. We felt our building, if we locked the door, was opening up. We felt our building was shaking with the bombing. I don't know how it came about. We all travelled together and we ended up at the top of the Suez Canal by the Mediterranean. And we all jumped into a barge, big barge. And the covered us in the middle. This is dead of the night. And covered us with tarpaulin over us. Jews from all over Egypt. And we took us to British battleships on the Mediterranean.
And that's how a lot of Jews from Egypt ended up in Britain, because they had British citizenship. They were brought to refugee camps in Britain, which were normally ex-army barracks, until they found permanent places to live. But again, we were talking about the differences of experience. And for Emmanuel, this thing of going along in a barge covered with his head covered, going on a ship, it was actually, he said, it was quite exciting as a child because he was protected.
It's a movie.
Yeah, he was.
It feels like a movie or something. It's incredible.
And their parents protected them a lot, as parents do. So actually, a lot of our interviewees, when we talk about leaving, they say, I was excited to go. I didn't think about it. And I think it's only when they look back later that they realize that actually that was something very hard. But at the time, these were, if you're 12 years old and you're that's how he felt. And I think that's not that uncommon.
No, just to say, I think it's a very important point that most interviewees actually left with their parents.
Yes.
So having trauma is less, which is quite different, let's say, when you look at the Kindertransport, in the late 30s, where 10,000 children came from German Austria by themselves, which of course left a much bigger trauma for those children because they had to come alone.
Absolutely.
So it was lucky in a way that they left. They could leave with their parents. But also, what I think important, that post 1956, where the Jews were expelled from Egypt, many of them became refugees and came to other countries, came to America, came to Britain. So in Britain, 1956. Britain received the Jews from Egypt, the refugees, but also the Jews from Hungary, who were also refugees. So I think that's quite interesting.
It's just that clip when I was listening to it beforehand was just incredible again because it is such. He tells it in kind of a matter of fact way. I mean, it's what happened to him, and yet the visual of that, the idea of leaving at nightfall, jumping on a barge, huddled under the tarpaulin is, again, it's just incredible. It seems like something that would come out of a movie, and it's something that if you say, thousands of Jews left Egypt, that's one thing, but to hear it from that particular person and to hear that particular narrative is just something else entirely.
There's a longer version of his story on our website as well in the Lives in Focus section. So you can hear more of the longer version of how he left Egypt there.
But you see,
absolutely,
this makes me very happy that you say that, because it just shows, how worthwhile our project is.
Yeah.
And if we have captured one voice, which makes you feel this is a movie or this is this is a special thing, then, that's makes our work worthwhile.
And these are stories that people don't hear about. People don't know about the Jews of the Middle East and don't know about the Jews of the North Africa and Iran. It's maybe slightly more now that organizations like us are trying to be making a bit of a noise about it, but it's not really something that's spoken about or talked about. And I think that's such a shame, because they're, first of all, amazing stories. They're brilliant people, and it's an important part of history. It's an important part of the story of the Middle East as well.
Some of the Egyptian Jews, or some of their interviews, tell us that, when people ask when they lived in England and they became professionals, and often people ask, so where's your accent from? And at the beginning they would say Egypt, and they say, Egypt? But, how come you're from Egypt? And it became such a complicated story that some interviews just prefer to say they're French, or, because it became too complicated to explain their multi-layered identity. And of course, what we also have to remember, that in places like Egypt, the memory of the Jews was often erased, where the local population really didn't know that there were so many Jews who lived there. So it is my hope that, our project will also go back to the places where people came from, and that, people will learn about the present. So, for example, think about in Baghdad, we had about 135,000 Jews in 1948, and we have about 5 Jews, in the whole of Iraq. But today we have in Baghdad, there are about 5 Jews today.
5, not 500.
I think 4 now, actually.
15.
I think one of them actually died very recently, so I think now it's 4.
Yeah, 4.
Wow.
People.
Yeah.
So when you look at the figures, they are sort of shocking. I mean, they're, you really think, how did it happen that these huge communities went to nothing, or,
and they've been erased from their own history. The history books in Baghdad, in Iraq, are not teaching this aspect of history.
Well, this is something that, again, we mentioned it before, but definitely worth mentioning again. New website, sephardivoices.org.uk, and you can also head over to the Reddit post that will be accompanying this podcast. You'll be able to click on the link there. You can also search Sephardi Voices UK on Google and to find it as well. A great way to look up some of this history that, as you have been saying, has been unfortunately erased, but thanks to your work, has not been erased completely and has been brought to light again.
Can I just add one example of this? Because you asked about music earlier. For example, you had very many musicians in Iraq were Jewish, and there was a very famous 2 brothers called the Kuwaiti brothers, and they had to emigrate. So many Iraqis today, they would hear recordings, but wouldn't actually know that those are recordings, of the Kuwaiti brothers, of Jewish musicians. And that's slightly changing now. And I think because of social media as well, there is more sort of awareness starting to come. And actually, I have a feeling you have people from countries like Iraq and Egypt really trying to explain what happened and looking for this part of history, which they don't know much about.
Yeah.
And maybe we should add, we have had, as part of our lockdown situation here in the UK, we have started doing some Zoom events. And on 2 occasions where we had 2 different Zoom events, we had there was one event about there was a synagogue has been rededicated in Alexandria, and we had some of our interviewees talking about going back to Alexandria, and there was actually a woman joined us from Alexandria on the Zoom event, which was wonderful. And in another event, we had a lady joining from Iraq, right?
Yeah,
Daisy?
it was an event with one of our Iraqi interviewees, and we had quite a few Iraqi people in Iraq joining in. So yeah, social media is actually amazing in the way that it can connect people and bring about history as well.
So that was for us definitely a positive consequence of lockdown, that we have these events and that we can be joined, as I said, by people from Iraq and from Egypt. That was just wonderful to be involved in that. But maybe sorry, go on.
No, good.
No, I was just
Go
going
ahead.
to say, because we have this wonderful clip also of Justin Trego, who's from Algeria. I wonder whether you wanted to listen to.
Yes, absolutely.
It's quite a different story, isn't it? Bed, you need to explain a bit. Because this is, again, a very different, and we keep emphasizing the fact that you can't generalize, and Algeria was a very, very different story than, probably unique, I think, actually.
So why don't you tell the story of Algeria, and then I speak about her, if you want to.
Algeria is a French colony, and in 1954, there was a war of independence. So it was the Algerian independence fighters, the FLN, they were known as, and the French forces. And then there was also the underground military French secret service, almost the OAS. And all these three elements were fighting either for or against independence. And there were, at that time, a lot of bombings in Algeria, in Algiers, the capital. Algeria did eventually get independence in 1962. And when that happened, the citizenship laws were changed so that only people with paternal Muslim parentage got citizenship, which meant that all the French nationals left, and also, of course, the vast majority of the Jews that were living in Algeria at the time. So
I could take over from here. So what is interesting about Algeria, there are two things. So first of all, that of course there was also Vichy law. So some people were actually deported. 2,000 Jews were deported to North African camps. So there are parts of North Africa which were affected. Libya and Algeria are two countries.
And Tunisia.
And Tunisia, and Tunisia as well. So that makes it different. But also that when the Jews left, they left as French citizens. So they in contrast, let's say, to Iraq, they left because they left with the French who had to leave. So their story is sort of linked to the post-colonial situation. So we have a wonderful interview with a lady called Jocelyn Trego, who was born in 1945 in Algiers. And, she shows us pictures. Her father was a postmaster, and she grew up, in a neighborhood called Bab El Wed in Algiers. In the interview itself, she also has a interesting, often in interviews, people show us objects, not only photographs and things, they show us objects. So with Ivy Shashua, for example, she showed me that she has nothing from Iraq, only one ring, which belonged to her husband. And she shows me this ring and says, this is all I have from Iraq. So that's another important aspect of interviews, which we haven't talked about. But let me come back. So Jocelyn showed me a big silver plate, a very, very big silver plate. And she said this belonged to her parents. And there was a pogrom in the city of Constantine in 1934. And this silver plate was damaged and sort of cut in two halves. And it was later repaired. And she shows me that this silver plate, and she showed me where that cut was, which was the damage from that pogrom. And it's important for her to explain to me the story. Anyway, she then talks in great detail about, her close-knit family and going to synagogue, going to the beach, and her very happy life, but then also about her very vivid memories of the Algerian civil war, in which she and her family were caught up. And she describes the normality of explosions and fighting in Algiers, and the difficulties or the trauma it has left her with. She says she still can't see blood, and she was very, very close to the violence. She then, in 1962, she convinced her father to leave Algeria before they were forced to leave, and he took up the job of a postmaster in Alès, in the south of France. So again, this is different because as French citizens, they could easily go to France, different from other interviewees. And in this clip, she describes what she experienced in the Civil War.
A lot happened. A lot happened. Events which I can remember. There were, what we call them plastic. I don't know what they were made of, but it was the plastic. And the Arab shops were plastiqués, and you had bombs in the street, you had bombs in dancing halls, you had bombs in a cinema, you had bombs in the milk bar, and you were sitting here. So you didn't know where the bombs came from. They might be OAS, or they might be, which is the French, or they might be Arabs, but there were a lot of people who were injured, and some in my family were injured by this plastic. One event, the one I was referring to, is my niece was at the time 1 year old. She was born in 1960. So she was 1 year old, and there was a plastic, a bomb in a nearby shop. And being 15 or 16, I actually covered her with my body. And when we finally saw what had happened, I was covered in glass.
You were?
I was, but the baby was safe. The baby was safe.
Yeah.
Another just narrative that is so gripping, something that you might not hear in an official history narrative, but something that feels like a scene out of a movie.
I agree with you, and so vivid, and I did this interview, and whenever I hear something like that, it's just it's very powerful, to hear it rather than hear a description of the Algerian Civil War, to hear how somebody was there and experienced it herself.
And I think
as
many interviews as you do, and as many times as you hear, you can hear people who left Egypt in 1956 hundreds of times, and it never gets old, it never gets boring, because every person has got such a unique experience, such a unique take on it. It's always gripping. So we were talking about listening, that it's not hard to listen to these stories.
No, it's not hard to listen. It's sometimes hard not to interrupt.
Yes, and for me, it's very hard. My biggest thing is noises that show I'm listening. So like and that I find very hard not to do, because that interrupts the flow in the recording.
Yeah,
but that's probably beside the point.
And just maybe to add in for Jocelyn Trego, she then, as I said, the family went to France. She studied in France. But then came to the UK as a teaching assistant, met her husband and settled in North London. And that's interesting as well, because often the stories we hear and we record are migrations to more than one country. So people went somewhere, then they went somewhere else. Also family members spread among many different countries. So we have, close-knit families sort of split up in different continents and different countries, and people keeping in touch throughout, and meeting and spending holidays together. But yeah, this experience really changed the structure of families and the family structure. And keeping in mind that there were Jewish families from the Middle East, North Africa, Iran. They were very, very close knit, where people, different generations, used to live together. So this was quite a big shock to the system.
It was a very communal lifestyle. I think across the board, that is a similarity, that it was a very communal lifestyle. Yeah. And a very outdoor lifestyle, because these were hot countries. And I think a lot of times you say, what was your first impression of the UK, or what was your first impression of Britain? And almost always the answer is the cold, the dark, the quality of the light. And I think you actually forget that geographical, that was a shock to the system as well. The smells even were so different to this life that they were used to. And that was an adjustment to make in itself, that you would go from this big outdoor communal lifestyle where a lot of things happened outdoors and into community and in different houses. And then you went to the UK where you were in your own little box terrace, indoors, where you didn't know your neighbours, and how isolating that was, especially for the parents of our interviewees who were older. You know, I think when you're a child, you integrate through school. And a lot of times they'll say, it was okay for me, but it was hard for my parents. It destroyed my father. He couldn't find another job. Or my mother never really managed to get the hang of the language in the way that I could. And I think that's a difference as well, that the generational difference, that when our interviewees were younger, and how difficult it was for their parents to make that adjustment.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and true for every group, you know, who migrates, that it's hardest for the older generations who have problems in adapting and problems with the language, you know, and other problems. But I think what Daisy said is the sort of rich tapestry where people came from and the sort of lifestyle. And I think it's manifested in the many photos we collect. They're absolutely wonderful photos, and they really evoke this sort of bygone life, you know, the beach, the people living in Baghdad, near the river Tigris.
Sleeping outdoors on the roof.
Sleeping, yes. So that's exactly, I was just coming to that. One of the main things in many Iraqi interviews is this description of sleeping on the roof in the summer, in the summer months.
And Sudan as well, they slept outside as standard.
Yes, and very elaborate, you know, descriptions of how it was prepared to sleep there, and then everything was taken down during the day and brought, you know, at nighttime, and different members or different families on one roof, and having different. So one had this corner, and another one had this corner, and they just evoke this wonderful, wonderful image, you know, of very different lives, and very happy lives.
And again, highly recommended to head over to the website. I'll give it again, sephardivoices.org.uk. You can also search Sephardi Voices UK, and there will be a link on the Reddit post accompanying this podcast. I think, as you said, just very evocative. People, I think a lot of people will like the fashion that they show, and the various you know, formal outfits and less formal outfits. It's really remarkable to see
some very gorgeous 1950s gowns.
Yes.
And also, what's wonderful, also we have photos where you can see where the dress demonstrate the change of identity. You know, especially, let's say, some of our Iraqi interviews,
and
that's
Moroccan
actually the main
as well.
on our website, and Moroccan also. You know, where you can see the older generation wearing a very different costume or dress from the younger generation, and you can see within one family the sort of change of fashion, change of identity. Wonderful, or, you know, and sometimes we have, you know, pictures of sitting in the garden, you know, with friends, many school photographs. I mean, many school photographs. What else do we have, Daisy? I
think wedding photographs. We've got lots of beautiful wedding photographs. I think we've really got a wide range. It encompasses all of life, and the pictures as well that people kept. You know, don't forget, these people left with not a lot, and the fact that they took those photographs with them also says something about the photographs that we have, in that these were the ones that they chose to save.
And sometimes people have their photographs because they were sent out to family members abroad. Yeah. So, for example, if you left Iraq pretending to go on a holiday, you certainly couldn't take your photos with you. So some of those people lost their photos, but have the photos which were sent out to members who were already abroad. and that's why we could capture them.
Those are all available up on the website, and you can also hear and see some of the interviews that they've conducted. And I think this is a good space to leave it at. So thank you very much to Bea Lewkowicz and also to Daisy Abboudi, both from Sephardi Voices UK, oral histories of, and some really spectacular oral histories at that, of various Jewish voices from all around the Middle East and North Africa. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. It's been really enjoyable.
Thank you for talking to us. Really enjoyed the conversation.
And again, you can find links to the website up on the Reddit post accompanying this podcast. I'm Tyler Alderson. This has been the Ask Historians podcast, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.